10 years after leaving Seoul, I saw her again in the rain, and everything I'd buried came rushing back. I still remember that day, the kind of rain that didn't just fall but carved into the bones of the city, relentless and unyielding. It felt as though the clouds were weeping, drowning the world in their sorrow. I had returned to Seoul that day, stepping back into a life I had tried desperately to leave behind, knowing full well that nothing would ever feel the same. Seoul had always been suffocating, with its cacophony of horns, laughter, and whispers of strangers brushing past. But there was also a silence hidden beneath the noise, an unspoken weight that pressed into my chest as I wandered its familiar streets. 10 years. A decade since I had left this city, carrying with me regrets I had been too much of a coward to face. The train station where I first stepped off felt smaller now, though it had been enormous in my memory. Age and time have a way of reshaping things. The city had grown taller, more skyscrapers, brighter lights, but the past still clung to me like a shadow. I hadn't planned to visit the café. Yet, as I passed familiar landmarks, my feet moved of their own accord, bringing me to a small side street where a faded sign swayed gently in the wind. The scent of roasted coffee beans wafted through the air, mingling with the cold dampness of rain-soaked pavement. The door creaked softly as I entered, and warmth greeted me, a stark contrast to the chill outside. I chose a seat by the window, running my fingers absently over the grooves of the wooden table. The rain beyond the glass distorted the city into a watercolor blur. Neon lights stretching into streaks of red and yellow, umbrellas bobbing like small ships lost at sea. In those moments, I could almost forget the ache that had brought me back. But then I saw her. At first, she was just a silhouette, walking through the rain with a deliberate slowness that suggested she didn't care to seek shelter. Her umbrella barely shielded her from the downpour, and her woolen coat clung to her shoulders as if weary from years of wear. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Even blurred by the storm, I recognized her. Yena. Her name formed unbidden in my mind, like a whisper carried by the wind. My heart rebelled against my better judgment, beating wildly as though it could erase the years we had spent apart. She stopped just outside the café, tilting her head slightly as though hesitating. My fingers tightened around the edge of the table, my body tensing as I willed her to come inside. But when the doorbell finally chimed and she stepped through, I wasn't ready. Her face was the same, though time had etched faint lines around her eyes, traces of laughter, or perhaps sorrow. Her dark hair, once long and flowing, now framed her face in soft, effortless waves. She glanced around the room, her gaze brushing past me once, then returning. Our eyes met. In that single moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. I wanted to stand, to say something, to reach for her. But I couldn't move. I could only sit there, paralyzed, as the years between us condensed into an instant. Yena's expression was unreadable, an indecipherable blend of surprise, recognition, and something else. Then, before I could gather the courage to act, she turned and walked away. The sound of the doorbell as she exited was sharp, almost jarring against the soft hum of the café. By the time I ran outside, she was gone, swallowed by the rain. The days that followed were a blur. I wandered the streets aimlessly, drawn to places I hadn't dared visit in years. The Han River, where we had once spent lazy afternoons skipping stones and dreaming of futures we hadn't yet feared. The old cinema, now shuttered and forgotten, where we had huddled in the back row, sharing popcorn and stolen kisses. Everywhere I went, I felt her presence, a ghost haunting the edges of my vision, a memory I couldn't shake. The city itself seemed complicit in my torment. Its rain-slicked streets reflected fragments of a past I had buried, pulling me deeper into a labyrinth of longing and regret. It wasn't long before I saw her again, or perhaps it had been days. Time felt meaningless. This time, she was seated on a bench along the Han River, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup as she stared out across the water. The sun was setting, its golden light breaking through the clouds for the first time in days. It cast a halo around her, painting her in hues of amber and gold. I stopped in my tracks, unsure whether to approach. My heart warred with my mind, the rational part of me screaming that I should leave her be. But my feet betrayed me, carrying me closer until I was just a few paces away. She turned her head slowly, sensing my presence. Our eyes met again, and this time neither of us looked away. She didn't speak, and neither did I. Instead, I sat beside her, the space between us charged with unspoken words and shared silences. The river murmured softly, its currents weaving tales that only it could understand. We sat there until the sun dipped below the horizon, until the stars began to emerge from the darkness. And in that quiet, beneath the vast expanse of sky, something shifted between us. That night, the dreams returned. Memories I had spent years trying to suppress flooded back in vivid detail, relentless and inescapable. I saw us as we had been, young and full of hope. I saw the way her eyes lit up when she spoke about her dreams, the way she laughed so freely as though she carried no weight at all. But I also saw the cracks, the arguments, the betrayals, the inevitable unraveling of what we had believed was unbreakable. I saw the moment I walked away, leaving her standing in the rain, her tears blending with the storm as she called my name. I woke with a start, the taste of regret bitter on my tongue. In the following days, I found myself returning to the river more often. Sometimes she was there, waiting. Sometimes she wasn't. When she was, we would sit together, side by side, the silence between us speaking volumes. There was an unspoken understanding between us now, a fragile truce born of shared pain and quiet yearning. I wanted to ask her so many things: where she had been, what her life had become, whether she still thought of me the way I thought of her. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, we let the moments pass, savoring the fleeting connection we had rediscovered. It wasn't enough, but it was all we had. And for now, it would have to be enough. It is strange how memories can feel like both a blessing and a curse. They slip in quietly, uninvited, and before you know it, they take over, drowning out the present, pulling you into a world that no longer exists. In the days that followed, Yenna and I fell into a quiet rhythm, meeting without planning, speaking without words. It was as though we had reached an unspoken agreement that the past, as painful as it was, no longer needed to be defined by what had broken us. Yet, the past is never truly silent. It lingers beneath the surface, whispering reminders when you least expect them. One afternoon, I returned to the Han River alone. The air smelled faintly of rain, though the skies had cleared. The bench where Yenna usually sat was empty, but the sight of it still stirred something inside me. I sat down and leaned back, letting my eyes drift shut as the breeze brushed against my face. I thought about the night we had first kissed. It had been on this very bench. We were just kids then, full of dreams and fire, oblivious to the ways the world could hurt us. I remembered the way her hand had trembled in mine, the way her breath had caught when I leaned in. For a brief, perfect moment, we had been invincible. But life has a way of testing even the strongest bonds, and ours had been no exception. It had started with something small, as these things often do. A missed call here, a forgotten promise there. I had been so focused on building a future, on carving out a career and proving to myself that I was worthy of success, that I hadn't noticed the cracks forming beneath us. Yenna had been patient at first. She had always believed in me, even when I doubted myself. But there are limits to patience, and slowly I began to lose her. I could see it in the way her smiles faded, in the way her laughter no longer reached her eyes. She tried to tell me in her own quiet way that she was slipping away, but I was too blind to see it, or maybe I just didn't want to. By the time I realized how far we had drifted, it was too late. A sudden gust of wind pulled me from my thoughts, scattering the leaves at my feet. I opened my eyes and turned my head, and there she was. Yenna stood a few steps away, her expression unreadable. She was wearing a pale blue coat that I didn't recognize, and her hair was pulled back into a loose braid. For a moment, we just looked at each other, the weight of the past hanging between us like a fragile thread. She didn't move closer, but she didn't walk away either. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, her gaze softening as though she could sense the storm inside me. In that moment, I wanted nothing more than to reach for her, to tell her everything I had been too afraid to say. But the words caught in my throat, and before I could find my voice, she turned and walked away, leaving me alone with my memories. That night, I found myself on the rooftop of my old apartment building. It was one of the few places that still felt unchanged, untouched by time. The city stretched out below me, a sea of lights and shadows, and for a while I just stood there, lost in the quiet hum of the night. I thought about Yenna, about the life we had once imagined building together, about the promises we had broken and the dreams we had left behind. And for the first time in a long time, I let myself feel the weight of it all. It wasn't just regret that filled me. It was grief. Grief for the life we could have had. Grief for the love we had lost. In the days that followed, I tried to keep my distance. I told myself that it was better this way, that some wounds were better left undisturbed. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop thinking about her. Everywhere I went, I saw reminders of her. The small bakery where she used to buy her favorite pastries, the bookstore where we had spent lazy afternoons browsing through dusty shelves, the tiny flower shop where I had once bought her a single red rose, just because. The memories clung to me like a second skin, refusing to be shaken off. And then one evening, I saw her again. She was standing outside the old cinema, her hands shoved deep into the pockets of her coat. The marquee above her was faded and cracked, the letters barely legible, but the sight of it still sent a jolt through me. We had spent so many nights there, huddled together in the dark, losing ourselves in stories that felt bigger than our own. It had been our escape, our sanctuary. And now, seeing her there, I felt a surge of longing so intense it nearly took my breath away. I approached slowly, my footsteps muffled by the rain-soaked pavement. She didn't turn around, but I knew she was aware of my presence. For a long moment, we just stood there, side by side, staring at the old theater as though it held all the answers we had been searching for. And then, without a word, she began to walk away. I hesitated for a heartbeat, torn between the urge to follow and the fear of what I might find if I did. But in the end, my heart won out, and I followed her into the night. We walked in silence, our footsteps falling into an easy rhythm. The streets were quiet. The rain was reduced to a gentle drizzle that clung to our skin. I didn't know where we were going, and I didn't care. All that mattered was that, for the first time in years, we were walking together. Eventually, we reached a small park tucked away at the edge of the city. The benches were empty, the swings swaying gently in the breeze. Yenna stopped near the playground, her gaze fixed on the horizon. I stood beside her, my hands shoved deep into my pockets, unsure of what to say. The silence between us was heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt familiar. For a moment, it was as though we had been transported back in time, to a place where things were simpler, where love was enough to hold us together. And in that moment, I allowed myself to hope. The past clings like a shadow, silent but ever present, a quiet reminder of what once was and what can never be undone. No matter how much time passes, certain memories refuse to fade, lingering just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to resurface. For me, the weight of those memories was heavier than ever, pressing against my chest with each breath, each step, each glance at a city that had once been my entire world. After the encounter with Yenna by the river, days passed in a blur. I wandered aimlessly through the streets of Seoul, haunted by the sight of her, by the memories of the life we had shared and the future we had lost. Every corner of the city held a piece of her, a fragment of a love that had once burned so brightly but had crumbled under the weight of broken promises and shattered dreams. The rain had returned, a soft, steady drizzle that soaked the city in a melancholy haze. I walked without purpose, letting the cold seep into my bones, hoping that somehow it might numb the ache inside me. But no matter how far I walked, no matter how many times I told myself to let go, I couldn't escape her. It was late at night when I found myself standing outside the café where we had first seen each other again. The lights were off, the chairs stacked neatly on the tables, but I could still picture her sitting by the window, her eyes distant and full of ghosts. I leaned against the lamppost, my mind drifting back to the night that had changed everything, the night that had torn us apart and set us on the path that had led us here. That night had been a storm in every sense of the word. The rain had been relentless, pounding against the pavement with a fury that matched the turmoil in my chest. I had been late. Again. It wasn't the first time, and deep down I had known it wouldn't be the last. My job had always come first, no matter how many promises I made to Yenna, no matter how many times I swore that I would change. When I finally arrived at the theater where we had planned to meet, she was waiting for me outside, her hair plastered to her face, her coat soaked through. She had looked so small, so fragile, standing there in the rain, and the sight of her had sent a pang of guilt straight through my heart. I had tried to explain, to apologize, but the words had felt hollow even to my own ears. I had seen the hurt in her eyes, the way her shoulders had sagged as though she were carrying a weight far heavier than just my broken promises. And then, without a word, she had turned and walked away, disappearing into the night before I could stop her. I never saw her again after that night. Not until she walked back into my life 10 years later, like a ghost risen from the past. The weight of that night had never left me. It lingered in the quiet moments, in the spaces between thoughts, a constant reminder of everything I had lost. And now, with Yenna back in my life, it was as though the wound had been ripped open all over again, raw and bleeding and impossible to ignore. I didn't know how to face her, how to bridge the chasm that had grown between us over the years. But fate, it seemed, wasn't done with us yet. It was a few nights after our silent encounter by the river when I saw her again. I had been walking through the city, the rain falling in soft sheets around me, when I spotted her in the distance. She was walking slowly, her head bowed, her hands buried deep in the pockets of her coat. There was a heaviness in her step, a weariness that mirrored my own, and for a moment I wondered if she too was lost in the past. I followed her at a distance, unsure of what I was hoping to accomplish, unsure if I even had the right to approach her after everything that had happened. She led me through the narrow streets of the city, past old haunts and forgotten corners, until we reached a small park tucked away between towering apartment buildings. She sat down on a bench near the edge of the park, her gaze fixed on the fountain in the center. The water cascaded down in gentle streams, the sound mingling with the soft patter of rain against the leaves. I hesitated for a moment, then slowly made my way toward her, my footsteps muffled by the wet grass. When I reached the bench, I sat down beside her, leaving a small space between us. We didn't speak. We didn't look at each other. We just sat there in silence, listening to the rain and the fountain and the distant hum of the city. I don't know how long we sat there. Time seemed to blur, stretching and contracting in ways that made it impossible to tell whether minutes or hours had passed. But eventually, Yenna shifted slightly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her shoulders tense. There was something in her posture, in the way she held herself, that told me she was carrying a burden, a secret that had been weighing her down for far too long. And suddenly, I knew. I knew that whatever had driven us apart all those years ago, whatever had caused her to walk away that night, it was more than just my broken promises and late arrivals. It was something deeper, something darker. As we sat there in the rain, the past and present tangled together in an intricate web, I felt a sense of dread settle over me, heavy and suffocating. I had spent so many years blaming myself for what had happened between us, but now, for the first time, I realized that there was more to the story. Yenna's hands trembled slightly as she stared down at them, her lips pressed into a thin line. I could see the tears glistening in her eyes, could feel the pain radiating off her in waves. And in that moment, I wanted nothing more than to reach out, to hold her, to tell her that whatever it was, we would face it together. But before I could move, before I could find the words, she stood up, her movements sudden and jerky. She wiped her eyes quickly, as though trying to hide her tears, and turned to face me, her expression a mix of determination and sorrow. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. The look in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. And then, without a word, she turned and walked away, leaving me alone on the bench, my heart heavy with the weight of unanswered questions and unspoken truths. That night, I lay awake in my apartment, staring up at the ceiling as the rain continued to fall outside. I thought about Yenna, about the life we might have had if things had been different, about the love we had shared and the pain that had torn us apart. I knew that whatever secret she was carrying, Whatever truth she had been hiding all these years, it was something that had shaped her, something that had left its mark on her soul. And I knew that if we were ever going to have a chance at finding our way back to each other, we would have to face that truth, together. But as I lay there in the dark, listening to the rain and the sound of my own heartbeat, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing on the edge of something vast and unknown, and that one wrong step could send us tumbling back into the darkness. Still, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Not when there was still a chance, a small, fragile chance, that we could find our way back to each other, that we could rewrite the ending to our story. And so, as the rain continued to fall and the city slept around me, I made a silent vow to myself. I would find Yenna. I would face whatever truth she was hiding, and I would fight for us, for the love we had lost and for the future we might still have. Because some things are worth fighting for, and Yenna was one of them. The rain had slowed to a gentle drizzle by the time I left my apartment the next morning. The streets of Seoul were quiet, shrouded in mist, as though the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And maybe it was, maybe we all were. I didn't know where I was going. My feet carried me through the familiar streets without direction, my mind lost in a haze of memories and unanswered questions. I kept seeing Yenna's face, the pain in her eyes, the weight in her shoulders. Whatever secret she was hiding, it had been eating away at her for years, leaving her a shadow of the girl I had once loved. But I couldn't fix it if I didn't know what it was. I couldn't help her if she wouldn't let me in. As I walked, my thoughts kept drifting back to that night, the night we had fallen apart. I had been so focused on my own guilt, on my own failures, that I had never stopped to wonder what Yenna had been going through. I had assumed that it was all my fault, that my broken promises and late arrivals had been enough to destroy us. But now, for the first time, I was beginning to see that there was more to the story. And I was determined to find out what it was. It was late afternoon by the time I found myself standing outside Yenna's apartment. I wasn't sure how I had ended up there, but as I stared up at the building, I knew that this was where I needed to be. I needed answers, and I wasn't leaving until I got them. I rang the doorbell and waited, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment there was nothing but silence. Then I heard the sound of footsteps, soft and hesitant, and the door slowly creaked open. Yenna stood in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes wide with surprise, and something else, something I couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe, or regret. We stared at each other for a long moment, neither of us speaking. Then, without a word, she stepped aside, silently inviting me in. The apartment was small but cozy, filled with soft light and the faint scent of lavender. I noticed a stack of books on the coffee table and a half-empty cup of tea on the kitchen counter. It was a space that felt lived in, warm and familiar, and yet there was a sense of emptiness, of loneliness, that hung in the air like a lingering shadow. Yenna gestured for me to sit on the couch, and I did, my hands resting awkwardly in my lap. She sat down across from me, her posture stiff, her gaze fixed on the floor. For a long time we just sat there in silence, the unspoken words hanging heavy between us. I wanted to ask her why she had left that night, why she had disappeared without a word, why she had never reached out. But I didn't know how to begin. I didn't know how to unravel 10 years of silence and pain in a single conversation. Finally, Yenna took a deep breath and looked up at me. Her eyes were filled with tears, and in that moment I knew that whatever she was about to say, it was going to change everything. She began to speak, her voice soft and trembling, and as the words poured out of her, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The night we had fought, the night she had walked away, she had been keeping a secret that she had been too afraid to tell me. She had found out that she was pregnant. I felt my breath catch in my throat as the weight of her words sank in. Pregnant. She had been pregnant, and she hadn't told me. She had been scared, she said. Scared that I wouldn't be there for her. Scared that I would choose my job over her, over our child. And so in a moment of fear and desperation, she had made a choice. She had decided to leave. But that wasn't the end of the story. A few weeks after she left, she had lost the baby. She had been alone, scared, and heartbroken with no one to turn to. And by the time she had recovered, by the time she had found the strength to face me again, it had been too late. I had already left Seoul. As she spoke, tears streamed down her face, and I felt my own eyes begin to sting. I wanted to reach out to her, to hold her, to tell her that I was sorry, that I would have been there for her if I had known. But I couldn't find the words. There were no words big enough to hold the weight of our shared grief. The silence that followed her confession was heavy and suffocating. We sat there, lost in our own thoughts, each of us grappling with the enormity of what had just been revealed. Finally, Yenna spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. She told me that she had spent the past 10 years trying to move on, trying to forget, but that no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape the past. She couldn't escape me, and that was why she had come back to Seoul. She had hoped that by facing me, by facing the past, she might finally be able to find some peace. For a long time, we just sat there, holding each other, as the rain continued to fall outside. There were no words left to say. We had both been broken by the past, both scarred by the choices we had made and the secrets we had kept. But in that moment, as we sat together in the quiet of her apartment, I felt something shift. I felt the weight of the past begin to lift, just a little. Because despite everything, despite the pain and the loss and the years of silence, we had found our way back to each other. And that had to mean something. In the days that followed, Yenna and I began to rebuild. It wasn't easy. The wounds were still fresh, the scars still tender, but we took it one day at a time, slowly learning how to be together again. We talked about the past, about the things we had lost and the things we still had. We talked about our fears and our dreams, about the love that had brought us together, and the pain that had torn us apart. And slowly, we began to heal. One evening, as the sun set over the city, we found ourselves back on the rooftop where we had shared our first kiss all those years ago. The sky was painted in hues of gold and pink, and the air was warm and still. We stood there side by side, watching the city come to life below us, and for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. Yenna reached for my hand, her fingers lacing through mine, and I squeezed her hand gently, a silent promise that we would face whatever came next, together. Because love isn't about perfection, it's about forgiveness. It's about second chances. And sometimes it's about finding your way back to the person who was always meant to be your home. As we stood there, bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun, I knew that our story wasn't over. It was just beginning. And this time, we were going to get it right.